Alright, you folks ready to go see something cool?
I have talked a lot about chip manufacture and how processors are made and things like that, but I've never actually gone and seen it. So after bugging Intel for months, they have invited me out here to their main manufacturing and research center outside of Portland, Oregon. And we are here to see not only how this stuff is made, but really to see the cutting edge next generation of processor manufacture. And this is going to affect everything from high-end computing all the way on down to your phones to the tiny chips in appliances and connected devices. And this stuff is wild. It is seriously space-age technology. So let's go check it out. This place is huge. It is like 4 of the biggest buildings you have ever seen in a giant campus out here in the suburbs. What we're talking about here is EUV, or Extreme Ultraviolet Lithography. Hi, this is me back at the desk. So, what is EUV? This is the next generation of manufacturing for processors and really any integrated circuits, and it is a giant leap forward. The tools that chip makers have been using for more than a decade have been redesigned from scratch, all in the quest for faster chips that use less power. Oh, and if you are just tuning in, this is Upscaled, our explainer show, and today we are explaining EUV. Cue the logo. EUV is a big deal because it's going to enable even smaller transistors. Now, we've covered this in previous episodes, but for a quick refresher, transistors are the tiny switches in a chip that do the work of computation, and making them smaller makes them faster and more energy efficient. Chips are manufactured these days in a process called lithography, and the current process essentially works like this. A laser shines ultraviolet light through a mask, which is sort of like the blueprint for the chip, and the image of that blueprint gets recorded in light-sensitive chemicals on a piece of silicon called a wafer. This works like a projector, except instead of projecting onto a screen, lenses shrink down the image of the mask and focus it onto the wafer. Now, it is a little more complicated than that. There are these chemical resists on the silicon that harden or soften only where light is projected, and then acids etch away the unexposed spaces, and also these days the whole thing happens underwater, but essentially do this process enough times and you get a processor. I went to Intel to see their work on the next generation of this manufacturing process, EUV, which scientists have been working on for more than 20 years. Now, the factory where chips are made is called a fab, and the whole place is a level 10 clean room, which means there are less than 10 particles of dust per cubic foot inside. All right, we are hairnetted and masked up here and ready to go, and we need to get a full body clean suit on here, so no dust entering. As pristine as we can be. This is a heck of a facility. We're gonna get prepared and head on into the fab. We even had to wipe down all of my camera gear to get any dust off before we were able to go inside. The first thing you'll probably notice is the light. Fabs are lit with yellow light because it's a relatively long wavelength. The resists, those chemical layers they use when making the chips, are mostly sensitive to short wavelengths, like blue or UV light, so the yellow light ensures the chips don't get prematurely exposed. All right, so we have gotten fully clean room suited up, and we are here actually in the fab. And in this room, what we have here is actually one of the EUV reticles. This is essentially the mask. This is what has the blueprint for the chip on it. You can see that really fine diffraction pattern from the incredibly fine features and details that this has etched into it. Now, this is just a test one. The actual reticles are so sensitive to dust and contamination that even suited up, it's still not actually safe to take them out. They spend pretty much their entire lives in these protective cases, but we're getting a chance to see with this sample one what they actually look like outside of the case. So remember, the mask is like a large-scale blueprint of the chip. And if normal lithography uses the mask and ultraviolet light kind of like a projector, EUV is a little different. Normal lithography uses ultraviolet light with a wavelength of 193 nanometers, but EUV uses light at 13.5 nanometers, hence extreme ultraviolet. At that tiny wavelength, the light is absorbed by almost everything, including glass lenses, the transparent quartz that normal masks are made of, and even air. So instead of transmitting light through a mask, EUV masks are reflective and use mirrors to bounce the light onto the silicon wafer. Oh, and all of this has to happen in a vacuum. The 193 nanometer UV light used in the normal fab comes from an argon fluoride laser, but to generate that 13.5 nanometer light, lasers aren't good enough anymore.
So behind me here, these are Intel's more advanced current EUV tools that they are developing this new process on. So you can see these are absolutely enormous. There's 3 of them in giant racks right here and space for more behind them. Now, one of the challenges here, these are massive and they operate under vacuum, so they had to create a high ceiling with a crane system, which can take more than 5,000 kilograms here, to actually lower in the massive vacuum systems they needed. Now, one thing with EUV, this does use a laser, but the laser is not actually producing the ultraviolet energy needed for the fabrication. The laser is vaporizing pure elemental tin. So behind me, what we just saw is the tin being reloaded into one of these machines, and it goes in actually just a large block of pure tin, which is then melted down into molten tin, which is ejected at tiny, tiny micron scale droplets. So the molten tin here is then hit with, in this case, a 25 kilowatt laser firing at 50 kilohertz. So incredibly fast pulses which hit these tiny, tiny minuscule droplets of that molten tin, vaporize it into a plasma, and that is what produces the energy which is actually used to make chips.
Let me reiterate some of that. In an EUV tool, a 30 kilowatt laser, which is maybe 15 times stronger than the ones used to cut steel, fires 50,000 times a second, with each pulse hitting a 30 micron wide droplet of molten tin and vaporizing it into plasma. The electrons in the tin absorb a ton of energy, and when they return to rest, they discharge some of that energy as EUV photons. And for the real nerds out there, it is the 4D atomic orbital that is doing most of the work. This is all according to Intel's EUV expert Dr. Turkett, who told us that only maybe 2% of those photons created actually reach the silicon. The rest get absorbed by the mirrors or scatter off in the wrong direction. This is part of the need for such huge amounts of energy. You need to make enough photons so that enough arrive at the chip and actually expose the image of the transistors you're trying to make. Working with molten tin is also kind of a challenge. A lot of the work developing EUV has been around how to keep the mirrors and emitters from getting coated in metal, which, you guessed it, drops the efficiency even lower.
Behind me here now is one of the prototype lasers that Intel used for its research into EUV. This is actually a modified laser from a company that makes automotive lasers for cutting steel for cars, and it's a 10 kilowatt carbon dioxide laser. Now, the laser originates in these giant cabinets, which are full of capacitors and amplifiers, bounces through this pipe down into the floor and into their actual experimental EUV lithography machine, which is behind us there in the background. As you might imagine, that takes a lot of power, 10 kilowatts, and generates a ton of heat. You can see the huge pipes and arrays that are channeling gallons and gallons and gallons and gallons of cold water through here every second to keep everything from melting down. So from cutting 3-inch thick plates of steel to now EUV.
Now, you may be asking, why did we pick Intel to feature here? There are actually a few other companies trying to develop this tech as well, and some of them already are using EUV in manufacturing, which Intel is not. TSMC in Taiwan, which manufactures chips for AMD, Nvidia, MediaTek, and a host of other companies, says it has EUV production up and running as of this past fall, and AMD's next chips will be partially made with EUV tools. The other big company is Samsung, which, in addition to its own chips, has manufactured chips for Qualcomm, Apple, Nvidia, and a bunch more. They announced in 2018 that they'd finalized their process for EUV, and the international version of the Galaxy Note 10 launched with the Exynos 9825 processor, which was Samsung's first product partially made with EUV. So why do we pick Intel? Well, they do have the advantage of being here. They have a massive chip fab in Oregon and research labs all throughout the Bay, and they also have been involved in developing EUV for more than a decade. See, behind the scenes, all of these companies use tools, the devices that actually make the chips, made by ASML, a Dutch company which makes a lot of the machines that manufacture electronics. it's fair to say that the challenges of EUV are too big for any one company, even one as big as Intel, to solve on their own. And Intel, and to some degree all of these companies, have collaborated with ASML and a half-dozen other suppliers to design the machines and the parts that can handle these crazy physics. But wait, if every company is using the same machines, why are some ahead? Well, there's three reasons. First off, each company sets different targets for how tiny they wanted the first gen of transistors made with EUV to be, and Intel was really ambitious. Second, the resists, those light-sensitive chemicals they're painting onto the silicon wafer, are different, and companies each have their own secret recipes. And third, the mask. The mask is a crucial part of the manufacturing process, and Samsung and TSMC and Intel are unusual in that not only do they make the chips, but they actually manufacture their own masks as well.
All right, so I saw some pretty amazing stuff up at Intel's EUV facility in Oregon, where they will actually be manufacturing their new chips. But if there's one thing I learned from going up there and talking with their scientists and engineers, it's that actually one of the really big changes in EUV lithography and in this whole new manufacturing process is the mask, which is that blueprint that is used to create all the chips. Well, it turns out that Intel actually manufactures its masks just down in Santa Clara, not too far from Engadget San Francisco offices. So I had to head down here to take a look at how they make those masks. Let's check it out. So this is actually even a higher grade of clean room than the one we saw up in Oregon. Up there, that was class 10, which essentially means there can be 10 particles of dust in the air per cubic foot. This one is a class 1, so it is 10 times less particulate. We have to go through the whole same clean room procedure, gowns, hats, the whole deal, and the booties on the shoes, because if there's any defect or dust on the mask, that's like having an error in the blueprint, and it will get copied onto every subsequent chip you try to print with that mask. So these have to be absolutely perfect and super duper clean. So this hallway behind me here is where a lot of the masks go through their first stages of production. So they come in as blanks, as essentially just slabs of quartz down at the end of this hall here, and they are inspected and prepped. Now, then a lot of the machines and stations behind me here are actually about inspecting that pattern, because again, defects are a big problem here. Everything has to be absolutely perfect. So they not only individually have to be perfect, they have to line up with maybe 50 other masks to an incredible degree. Any tiny misalignment, things can get misprinted, you can have errors and defects, and your chip won't work. So this hallway is all about precision.
When chip manufacture first started, people would actually draw out the chip layout by hand on a wall-sized blueprint and then photograph it and shrink it down to print 1-to-1 size on the chip. As processors got more complicated, that wasn't an option anymore. Modern masks are with an electron beam, and they're made much larger than the final chip, with lenses, or now mirrors, shrinking down the projection to the proper size. According to Dr. Aboud, Intel's chief mask scientist, one mask for the current 14 nanometer process contains around 4.69 petabits of information. A petabit, that is with a lowercase b, is 125 terabytes. So one mask holds the equivalent data to maybe 145 million smartphone photos, give or take a few million. This seems incredible, but a modern desktop chip contains between 3 and 4 billion transistors. So yeah, it takes a lot of data. Still, because the features on a chip are now so much smaller than the 193 nanometer wavelength of the light currently used to make them, multiple masks and exposures are needed to create those tiny, tiny features. EUV could simplify this, using one mask to replace what might have required 4 in the past. The first gen of EUV will do just that, replacing just a few essential and especially complex layers with EUV, while the rest of the chip will be made with conventional means. But in a few years, we can expect to see entirely EUV-made devices. Considering a modern chip can require around 50 masks, and each mask increases both manufacturing time and adds to the potential for errors, cutting that number by a quarter could save companies a lot of time and money, and ideally make for cheaper chips for all of us. Intel nearly has its EUV production ready, but one last thing they are finalizing is called the pellicle. After all of this care with defects and clean rooms and keeping everything totally pristine, the pellicle is a transparent seal that goes over the mask and keeps any dust from ever landing on it. A tiny speck of dust could literally obliterate millions of transistors and lead to a lot of junked chips. In the past, the pellicle used a material like cellophane, but you guessed it, that is totally opaque to EUV light. So the challenge is finding a material that EUV photons will pass through that can still protect the mask from dust. Presumably other companies in this field have already cracked this challenge, but if they are, they aren't sharing any secrets.
All right, we just got outside of the clean room. I am drenched in sweat. Those suits are definitely warm, but we really saw some incredible stuff here at Intel. We are getting one of the first looks at this technology, at this fab, and it's kind of incredible. So I hope you appreciate what you got a chance to see. Now, the one downside of showing any new proprietary technology like this is, again, a lot of it is proprietary, so there was so much more that I saw that I can't show you. Hopefully in the future, maybe those things will become a little bit more public knowledge, and maybe we can go back and check some of it out. But there was a lot of incredible stuff that unfortunately we just couldn't get on film. This technology is just at a different scale than what I was even expecting. These machines are massive, and Intel is clearly sinking a lot of labor and money and effort into getting this process perfected. Now, we should start seeing some EUV-derived products in the next year. Will they bring the performance improvements we've been hoping for? It's too early to tell, but Intel is already working on the next phase of technology after EUV. It's called High NA for numerical aperture. And just like EUV required a whole redesign of the mask system and the light source, High NA is going to require an entire redevelopment of the entire optics system, all the reflectors and mirrors, because again, I can't use lenses, remember, all the mirrors that are required to transmit the light onto the chips. If EUV doesn't deliver what we're expecting, maybe High NA will, but I'm hopeful. So thank you for watching and coming along on this journey for us. Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more Upscaled.